I'm Rachel.
And I'm Leah.
And this is Hashtag History,
the podcast for both history nerds and history haters alike,
where we dive into history's greatest stories of controversy, conspiracy, and corruption. This is Hashtag History, episode 130. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Leah.
And this is our season 13 finale episode. We have made it to the end of yet another season. And for all of our longtime listeners, you know that means that we are super honored to be joined by a special guest for this week's episode.
Yes, we are so honored this week because we are joined by none other than Carol Daly, the first woman appointed as Undersheriff with the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office, the first woman appointed chair of the Board of Prison Terms, and so many more firsts for women in criminal justice in our area, which we will definitely be getting into in this episode.
We will. And for those that have listened to last week's episode where we covered the Golden State Killer, you will be particularly interested to learn that Carol was actually designated as one of the lead investigators on the Golden State Killer case. We really are so honored to have you here, Carol. Thank you so much for joining us this week on the podcast.
Well, thank you for asking me.
Absolutely.
So I know we already gave a very brief introduction to you, but please tell us and our listeners more about yourself, and maybe starting chronologically, like with when you first became interested in serving in law enforcement, and then onto like how your career grew from there.
So the question is often asked me, how did you get into law enforcement? Well, I grew up in a small town in Nebraska, and so there were no role models of women in law enforcement, and women weren't really being used in law enforcement. It was, a man's field. And I moved out to California in about 1960, doing payroll. And then I learned about civil service. And so I decided that it looked like a good way to go. And the money was actually a little bit better than in private industry. And so I took a test with Sacramento County and passed the test for clerk typist 1, about the lowest position in the civil service that you could get. But they had just established the new Sacramento County Crime Laboratory. Ellen Gilmore was the first criminalist that was hired for Sacramento County. And having an interest in medical field, I would go in and watch some of the autopsies. And my husband, Ted, brought in an announcement, and he said, hey, they're hiring female deputy sheriffs. And I said, oh, well, I'd never thought about going into law enforcement, although I had worked with a lot of law enforcement personnel because they would come into the coroner's office and bring in evidence to be booked at the crime lab and, come in and follow up on their investigations. But I looked at the salary, and it was double what I was making as a secretary.
Yeah, that's tempting.
So there were 6 of us that were eligible, and all 6 of us were hired. And we started the academy in December of 1968. I was picked to go to detective division. And the detective division at that time, I was investigating missing persons, runaways, obscene phone calls, vandalism. We used to investigate all of those. Everything that came across the desk, we investigated. Of course, you can tell it was a much slower time. Actually, I worked every rape case that came into the department. And
Wow.
And then I transferred into homicide, and I was working there for 7 years. And then about another year after that, I worked major crimes on a swing shift. So there was a lot of work to show that we could do the job and to work with them on crime scenes and things. And so it was a little bit difficult at first.
I imagine that was a difficult position to be in. How did you navigate it? And or what advice would you have for women in a similar position?
I think hard work. I never took anything for granted. I always, you would volunteer for assignments that nobody else wanted, or volunteer for projects. The more that you can learn, I think that's very important, that you never do anything on your own, that you always have a team and you always have people who are helping you. We all have our detractors at work, and we all have our supporters. And so you can't let the detractors get you down.
Yeah,
I think that's great advice. And can you speak to some of the numerous awards and honors that you have received?
getting some of the awards and honors that I had along the way. One of them was, Breaking the Glass Ceiling Award. Unbeknownst to me, Sheriff Craig had nominated me to be California State Woman Peace Officer of the Year. And they selected me to be the Woman Peace Officer of the Year in California. Well, that committee forwarded all of the nominations from all over the U.S. internationally to an International Association of Women Police. And they reviewed them all. And I was selected International Woman Peace Officer of the Year and went to England to receive the award. I had a lot of honors, but I have to tell you, the honors were secondary. The awards, they were really nice. But the biggest reward I have had in my career are the people that I worked with and the victims that I have maintained contact with over the years. And what you can do for other people outweighs any award that you can get.
We noticed a lot of your career revolved around sexual assault and rape cases. Is that something that you were, personally drawn towards, or was it perhaps an area that you noticed had a void that needed filling? Like what kind of drew you to those cases?
A lot of the guys did not like working rapes or sexual assaults. I know some officers that absolutely could not work a child abuse case. Mm-hmm. They absolutely couldn't. And if you can't work a rape case, then you say, please don't assign me one. Assign it to somebody who will really do justice for the victim. And I think for me, my career was a little bit different because I was assigned to detectives early on, which meant I worked with a team. And also, my husband was coming onto the department. I had a brother-in-law. I had two brother-in-laws. One of them worked up to be chief deputy before he retired. You'll find that law enforcement is very family-oriented. Mm-hmm. And so when I went back to visit the sheriff's department, but I think that kind of runs true of, all families, if they're in a career and the children are exposed to it. So we had 3 boys and a girl. None of the boys wanted to go into law enforcement. Our daughter, Terry, retired as a sergeant and had finished her master's degree and was going to be teaching. But both her and her husband retired early. Law enforcement takes a toll on you with the hours and the call outs and the court appearances and the scrutiny from the public.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to piggyback off of something that you shared, knowing that you handled so many cases of child abuse and rape, sexual assault and harassment. How did you do that mentally, psychologically? Because like you already shared, there are some people that just can't handle those types of cases. How did you get into the right mindset and kind of maintain a realistic outlook?
The only way you can handle those cases is to remove yourself from the horrible stuff and know that you're there to help the survivor, the victim. You're the first point of contact. Taking a child out of a home where they have been beaten. Oh, I've seen some horrible, horrible cases, but you have to remove yourself. This isn't about you. This is about the victim. And that's the only way that you can handle these cases. By the time I got through and the East Area Rapist had left our jurisdiction, I was so fearful he was going to kill. I just knew he really wanted to kill. And I was so afraid the next call I got was going to be to a homicide instead of a rape. I was so burned out. After he was gone for a while, I was still on the task force. So once he left the jurisdiction and we knew that he had gone on to other jurisdictions and hadn't resurfaced, I went in to the captain and I said, I need to go back to homicide. Mm-hmm. And he said, Carol, there's trauma in homicide. And I said, I know, but we're solving our cases. I said, I can't face another victim. It was all over the media. There were headlines every time we had a rape. We had big community meetings. Everybody was talking about, the rape. And it was so hard to go to yet another rape, knowing that we hadn't been able to identify. The responsibility was huge.
That is really jarring to me that handling a homicide was almost easier than a rape. When I say easier, I don't mean easier, but that it was more, you had more closure.
Right. You had closure, and going to another victim with all of the media and everybody knowing how horrific this guy was and the lives he had ruined, and not having the answers for the victim was so hard.
I'm sure.
I went back to homicide, and I worked in the course. And when I was promoted to sergeant, after that, I never went back to detectives. I think an officer needs to know when they're burned out, when, you just can't do your best anymore, or when it's finally just getting to you. And I was spent. Emotionally, I had nothing more to give.
Yeah. I can't imagine. That actually was a perfect segue because, of course, we wanted to ask you more about your involvement with the Golden State Killer case. That's something that we recently covered on our podcast, and it's a case that, for lack of a better word, we have found fascinating. I can't really think of another word, simply because of how close it hits to home, and just knowing this community so well, and knowing that that's the location in which he harmed and killed so many people. And you were one of the lead investigators on that case. So can you walk us through your involvement in that case, what that was like?
I can look back now and say how rewarding it was to me, not because of what I went through at the time, but what I have been able to connect with the victims since then, and seeing them over the years, and what the traumatization of victimization does to people, and especially rape cases, and how life altering it is. And so the very first victim was Phyllis Zitka, and that one was in June of 1976. I did not respond to Phyllis's rape case. She was very traumatized by the officers that investigated her case, the way she was treated. The victim comes first before anything. So I didn't respond until the second or third case, and then the fifth case. So I was hit and miss. So I didn't hit all of it until they pulled us onto the task force, and then the task force responded to every rape. The East Area rapists propelled rape investigations into the 20th century. I mean, there was so much that came out of doing all of those investigations that enhanced the ability to investigate these cases, working with outside agencies. We had every tool available to us that there was at the time, and we used it. There was so much community buy-in on this. And remember, prior to 1978, rape was a misdemeanor. You only had a year to prosecute it.
Yeah.
And it was Governor Brown that signed into law that it was a mandatory prison offense, which made it a felony.
So this case really revolutionized how rape victims were treated.
Yes.
Wow.
When the East Area rapists was attacking, rape crisis centers were just starting up.
Now, you kind of touched on some of the advances that were happening while you were investigating the East Area rapist. And I know one of those advances that ended up catching him was the DNA technology. So I'd love to hear kind of what your personal reaction and thoughts were when you heard that Joseph DeAngelo had finally been caught and was caught via DNA technology.
Okay, so going back in history some, I told you that I was so afraid that he was going to murder. Well, and he did. But in 1990, I got a phone call from Sheriff Lou Blanis at the time, and he said, Carol, they've just matched the DNA from all of our rapes to all of the murders in Southern California. And I said, I knew he was going to kill. I just knew. We had this fear. I think what hung over all of the investigators during those investigations is there something that we could have done? And identifying him, what could we have done to have prevented those murders? That weighed heavy, very heavy, because at that time, the whole community was up in arms. I mean, everybody was arming themselves. They were buying alarms. They were buying locks.
I literally shared on the podcast the last week's episode about the Golden State Killer. My mom said she slept with a knife under her pillow at the time.
So when we would go to the community meetings, none of the guys wanted to be up front. And because I had interviewed all of the victims, I could answer their questions. So I was front and center in front of the audiences answering all of the questions. So because of that, and because of newspaper coverage and all of the media, I remember when he was arrested, people started calling me and saying, congratulations, the East Area rapist has been arrested. And I said, I had nothing to do with it. I mean, my history goes back back to the original investigation, and it was years of officers doing investigations. Then when Anne-Marie Schubert took office, it was her goal to try to identify him and doing the DNA. I had nothing to do with any of that. I would like to have had, because it was an exciting time using DNA to solve crimes. I've been back to several trials testifying on homicide cases that I worked that were now solved by DNA. So it's a great tool. So I get credit for stuff that everybody else did. But and he was arrested, and they called and say, congratulations. And I was just so front and center that everybody identified me with it. And yet it affected the dispatchers, the records clerks, the people that had to type reports and read everything. It affected everybody in the department, not just the investigators that were out working. I remember I knew when they identified the DNA with the rapes with down south. So then in 2018, was it, when he was arrested, I get a call from Sheriff Scott Jones. And I had never worked with Scott. I didn't personally know him. I knew of him. And he called and he said, Carol, I just want you to know we just arrested the East Area rapist. And I said, you got to be kidding.
I can't even imagine how that must have felt.
And I was in disbelief. And he said, no, in fact, he's in booking right now. And his name is Joseph D'Angelo. And I said, you've got to call the victims right now. And he said, start calling, because he knew I'd had contact with so many of them. And I thought, oh, what a privilege. I really felt honored. I'm not an officer. I'm retired, but everybody knew that I had so much invested, with these survivors and the things that we had done over the years together. And he said, start calling. But the first couple that I called, I told him, I said, they've just identified and arrested the East Area rapist, and her and her husband were home. Their first comment was, we're going to sleep tonight. It was 40-some years later after their attack, and they had never been able to have a peaceful night's sleep. But there's so many fascinating things in connecting with the survivors. I am just amazed at women. And Jane Carson Sandler was the first one that said, by gosh, I've been a victim and everybody's going to know it. She said, I'm taking charge. And she has worked with victims ever since. She did her recovery, and she wrote a book, and she's done speaking engagements. And because of Jane, many of the other victims came along and said, we can let it be known we were a victim too. So to take that step to go forward, it really led a lot of the other survivors to want to come forward. The very first victim, Phyllis Zitka, not happy with the officers who responded. And Chris Pedretti. Chris was 15 at the time that she was raped. She was at home, was looking forward to going to high school because she wanted to make a difference on campus. Her parents had gone to a Christmas party, and she was at home playing the piano, and she heard a noise. She stopped playing for a little bit, and then she started playing again, and then the rapist was right there. Horrible, horrible rape. Now, these rapes lasted sometimes over 2 hours. Her story and everything that she has accomplished since then is just amazing. She was never allowed to talk about it. She said the first question her father asked was, what color was he? And after that, it wasn't, are you okay? It was, this didn't happen. You're never going to talk about it, and we don't want to hear about it anymore. And that was how her parents handled both of them.
I can't imagine what that did to her psychologically, to have felt shame for something, for being violated.
Right. Her life took a totally different direction, and it's Chris's story, so I'm not going to tell it. But I received a phone call in 2018 from Chris. She had gotten my phone number from some of the other survivors, and she said, you didn't work my case. I have never talked about it. My parents are both deceased, and I need to sit down and talk with you. So I ran out to the sheriff's department. Sheriff's department was very accommodating, picked up a copy of her report, drove to Elk Grove, and sat down with Chris and her sister and her husband. And for the first time, she told her story.
Oh.
And it was, I was at a loss because I didn't know what to do. So I had one of the current investigators, female investigators that was doing follow-up on the case, go out and talk with Chris. 3 weeks later, Joseph D'Angelo is identified and arrested.
Oh, wow. That gave me goosebumps.
It was amazing. So Chris really just took the bull by the horns. Phyllis Sitka and Chris became great friends. They connected and they were here at our house to film a documentary. And I have pictures of them in the backyard together and they're both smiling. Phyllis Sitka passed away from cancer and we were at her side on her deathbed because we had all become so close together. So would it be easy to say, oh, I don't work cases anymore, call the current investigators, but I found myself drawn back into the survivors and talking with them. And after he was arrested, I heard one of them say, well, let's just meet at a restaurant afterwards. And I said, no. I said, I'm 5 miles from the courthouse. I'm right off I-5. When the court is over, you're coming to my house. I will have food and you can talk. Nobody will be listening. Nobody will be staring at you. And so that was just the practice. After each one of the gatherings, they all came to our house and some of the other investigators from other agencies, Paul Holes was here. And it was a healing time. And I wouldn't trade that for anything because I've made such beautiful friends, from this. But what I've been able to see is the trauma that any crime, not just with the East Area rapist, any woman who has been violated, it's traumatizing and it changes their life. Just helping them, through that, you're never going to erase it and the memories are going to be there. But seeing what they have been able to accomplish and what they've been able to do to put their life back together is just amazing. They're strong, strong women.
Yeah, the word Leah and I kind of kept throwing back around as we were looking into this case was resilience.
Yes.
Just they're so resilient. Thank you so much for sharing all of that and especially kind of diving into the trauma that, sexual assault victims experience. And I imagine that trauma is so much more intense when you can't speak about it or you don't feel comfortable speaking about it. There's so much healing in just telling your story.
So what Chris did, she established a support group online. She said, I don't care if I just have one person and it's sexual assault survivors. It's time to tell your story because so many women have never dealt with it. She now has over 800 that are on that site and she has counselors that are there to talk to them. And they don't even have to talk about their story. They can just call in and say, I was a victim and listen to the other people talk. She is also teaching at the academies for sexual assault investigators. And so for the first time last week, I went with Chris to one of the classes and I was able to share with them a letter from a victim who talked about the trauma. But the thing that got her through was the initial contact. And she was a victim. Her sister had been murdered. And I just happened to be working that case. And she said, it was what you said to me and what you did that got me through that. I said, this was not your fault. And if she had been there, she'd have probably been a victim too. She said, I pushed it aside. I got married. I had my family and then my kids all left home. And I now am thinking about it. And she said, it saved my life.
Wow.
Did I do everything right? No. There were some things that I did wrong, but I learned from them. And I made sure that, when I taught that people don't do the same thing. When you work, it's all about the victim and their recovery. It's not about what fame or how many arrests or anything that you can make.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That was all really, really moving. And thank you also for sharing so much more about your involvement with the Golden State Killer case. I know your involvement with a few other more infamous cases is more brief, but we did want to ask, just because they are so infamous, what your role was in the Richard Chase murders or the UC Davis sweetheart murders.
Richard Chase was at a time in the community when we were dealing with the East Area rapist. Okay, so I was already part of the task force they were horrible crimes. And the sheriff he had every deputy available working overtime, trying to figure out, to make the arrest on Richard Chase. And actually that case wasn't that ongoing because they were able to make an arrest, right away. My partner and I got the call. We went to visit the family whose baby had been kidnapped and murdered by Richard Chase. I can't even read about the horrible things he did. He was a vampire killer. He ate organs. He cut organs out and put them in the freezer, and he drank the blood. He was really a very, very horrible man. So my part of the investigation, my partner and I, we interviewed the family that had lost the little baby. And here again, no closure. We hadn't found the baby yet. And then we got a call to go to Richard Chase's apartment. And my partner and I went there, knocked on the door, and he was living in an apartment on the second floor, and there was no answer. So we left. And then shortly after that, the patrol officers and detectives got there. They had to hide, and Chase thought they were gone. And he came out and he was apprehended. My contact really more just peripheral in working that case, but it was very much a part of what we were doing in the community because we were working the East Area Rapist at the same time. And that was probably one of the worst cases that any of the officers had ever worked. The Davis Sweetheart murders, all you have to do is Google Davis Sweetheart murders and it'll bring up the story. But this is two 18-year-old freshmen, University of Davis students who had just volunteered working for a Nutcracker show, and they were leaving to go to a baby shower for her sister. And they stopped to pick up a card. And when they did that, Richard Hirschfield kidnapped them and put them in the car. And it was in December. And I received a call to respond to the crime scene. So I described the whole crime scene, went to where the bodies were dumped over a ravine, had to describe everything. And then I went to the coroner's office and watched the autopsies to make sure all of the evidence was collected and recorded and everything. Then did a little bit of follow-up, but because of other cases that I was working. So typically when we had a major call out like that, every homicide detective responded, and some would do the scene, some would do other things, some would do some interviews, and then it would be assigned out. So I did not get assigned to do all of the follow-up on that case, but it was years later when that case here again was identified through DNA and Hirschfield was arrested.
Wow. That's amazing.
To close us out, we'd love to know, what would you consider your greatest professional accomplishment in your law enforcement career?
I think my greatest accomplishment, people would say, well, being appointed undersheriff or working for the governor. But really, here again, I have to go back. And my memories are the people I worked with, the officers that did a great job. Some of them, we're still friends. We stay in touch. The contacts that you make in the community and working with survivors. To me, that was always what it was all about. I had no idea I was going to go into law enforcement, but it sort of became my mission field and being able to help people. I don't know if that made a difference because I just have always loved people and always wanted to help. But you take advantage of every open opportunity and then you run with it. And sometimes you go in one direction and sometimes you go in another. There were women that came on. One left to go to the district attorney's office as an investigator. Another one left, became an attorney. And so you just go with where it leads you and then you just try to do the best job you can.
Thank you so much again, Carol, for all of your time, for coming on the podcast. This really was a very moving and inspiring conversation, and one that I know our listeners are going to love. So thank you.
Well, I hope so. If it's going to be closing out your season, I hope they say.
Well, we really appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of #History. For all of our listeners out there, be sure to continue to follow us on Instagram at #history_podcast to see when we will be returning for season 14. Also, be sure to check out our website at #history-pod.com for more information about us, to listen to past episodes, check out our super cute merchandise, and to find ways to support the podcast. Thanks again, and we will see you all soon.